in terms of polling popularity, as well as where the main opposition, the Conservative Party, sits. So I'm going to go through that now. So first, to start off, this is some polling that Nanos has conducted based on the question of preferred prime minister between all of the leaders. So basically what we've highlighted here where the prime minister's polling sits as of December 6th, so quite recently. And as you can see, it's starting to show a bit of an upward trend. It's too early to say if a pattern is forming, but it does appear, at least for the time being, that the prime minister's popularity could be starting to rebound significantly to pre-election levels in just over the last few weeks, really, since election day.
And I would probably argue that the height of 37 is probably higher than he'd been well before the election, since before SNC Lavalin.
Absolutely. So again, it's too early to suggest a longer-term trajectory, but the prime minister's popularity definitely has started to rebound considerably, and time will tell to see as that moves along. As you've probably noticed over the last few weeks, the prime minister has mostly, with some exceptions, mostly stayed out of the limelight, and overall public interaction has been rather limited. This may speak to a new approach in terms of the government being a little bit more inward focused and more focused on a bit of a reset as the new parliament kicks off and starts to get underway. Generally, the new approach, again, could be working as clearly polling is starting to indicate an upward swing in popularity. And especially as foreign affairs start to become less of an immediate or burning focus next to more pressing domestic matters that really the prime minister, of course, will be relying on the strength of his ministers to conduct. And of course, there are still some foreign matters dealing with the relationship with China being a key one, but generally there's a bit more of an inward focus on this minority parliament. And the other thing to keep in mind is just the government's been extremely busy over the last few weeks, extremely focused on internal matters. Quite a lot has come underway in terms of cabinet, the throne speech, mandate letters, all recently, and so there's been a lot of kind of an inward effort to get things moving for the new government. So as we saw just last Thursday, former leader Andrew Scheer has resigned, and so that puts the question forward about who will take over the opposition, and ultimately, if the Conservative Party can have a pretty strong candidate put forward, that could raise their chances significantly of defeating this Liberal minority government when they go back to the polls. So what we have here, just to give an overview of where attitudes might sit to, broadly speaking, to alternatives to Andrew Scheer as Conservative leader. This polling is from Abacus data, and on the left, there's a broad kind of nationwide poll of attitudes towards alternatives to Andrew Scheer, and on the right, a poll that's just based on those who voted, Conservative voters from the recent election. So, broadly, Canadian voter preferences, what this poll is showing is most people are preferring alternatives to Andrew Scheer. But again, that poll likely includes those who didn't vote Conservative at all, and that in some way may speak to the former leader's challenges that he had connecting with certain elements of the population during the election. The poll on the right, though, is interesting because it shows that really, with exception of a comparison to Harper, of the Conservative voters, many actually still feel that they support Andrew Scheer's leadership, because again, this poll was conducted after the election and relatively recently. And so that could speak to a bit of a discrepancy between attitudes of the broader Conservative base and and those of more in that kind of internal party politics that has been going on over the last few weeks in efforts to push the leader out.
So the only qualification we'll make to this poll is that we wanted to provide you a little bit of something based on what was out there in the world. Frank from Abacus was tweeting last night that he's out in the field on this now. I think you're going to see these numbers shift significantly because these are numbers that were collected before Andrew Scheer resigned. And I think you'll get a different perspective from people now that Andrew Scheer is no longer going to continue as leader. And I was seeing that the Stephen Harper preferability is actually significantly less now that people actually have to decide as a conservative voter where they might want to put their votes. And then I believe the list of people that Abacus was testing for is broader. Rona Ambrose is in there. So keep an eye out, and we'll try and put it up when that survey comes out. We'll try and circulate it because it'll just be fun to see where conservative voters and Canadians at large feel they would want to put their support with a new conservative leader.
So spoke about this a bit already, but of course, in terms of the implications of changing conservative leadership, it's huge. I mean, a new conservative leader could come into place quite quickly. The party is already predicting that this leadership round will move a lot faster than it did in 2017. So we could have a new conservative leader very quickly, and that new leader may be, especially if they're quite popular and they have a much broader Canadian support than the former leader, that leader may be tempted to get back into an election a lot sooner, before Trudeau has the chance to kind of go through a full reset and repair his popularity. So again, no party right now, of course, is ready to head back to an election. I mean, in terms of financial, human resources, all of that is down across the board, and they need time to repair that. But the Conservatives traditionally have been most resilient in handling a snap election, particularly based on their fundraising levels, and so it's quite possible that they would be able to handle that relatively soon. So, as Peter spoke about, we'll see a little bit more in terms of how this unfolds. These are some 3 names that have been kicked around over the last few days. And some even more strongly suggesting that they're quite interested and will move forward. But time will tell to see how the leadership unfolds. So that's for now. I'll hand it over to my colleague Hannah, and she's going to talk a bit about healthcare in the news over the last few weeks.
Thanks, Ian. So here at Santis, we track health news stories both provincially and federally, and package them up to our clients on a daily basis. And a lot of you watching right now probably received those news scans. But in the past year in particular, we've seen the same few news stories consistently return to headlines. Pharmacare, of course, is extremely top of mind and continues to pop up whenever the government or any opposition party makes an announcement or an advancement on the file. Most recently, Canada's provincial and territorial premiers met back on December 2nd for a Council of the Federation meeting, and healthcare was identified as one of the 4 priority areas that came out of that meeting. And in particular, the provinces expressed hesitation about a national pharmacare program at this time, and they requested the option to opt out just due to their provincial context on the file. And there was also a unanimous call out of this meeting to increase healthcare transfer payments by 5.2%. So it'll be interesting to monitor provincial reaction and its impact to federal commitments as the Trudeau government continues to make advancements on each of the priorities that they've laid out in terms of healthcare. The opioid crisis, of course, has been a huge story due to its relevance and impact across the province. And in contrast, while the opioid crisis has been a key news story for about 3 to 4 years now, stories related to vaping-related illnesses has only popped up in our news scans over the past 6 months, I would say. So although it is relatively new, at the same time, it does have a huge impact, and there has been a big priority placed on this issue by the Trudeau government. So we wanted to map out how relevant each of these top 3 news stories that we've identified are among Canadians. So we used Google Trends. Google Trends is a tool to map out search volume and the intensity of different queries using Google, of course. And this graph identifies those top 3 news stories, so pharmacare, vaping, and opioids, and it charts their relevance in Canada over the past year. So as you can tell, all 3 topics have remained mostly consistent in intensity and relevancy, with slight peaks during key political milestones. So that includes the federal election on October 24th, the date that Trudeau announced his cabinet and the recall of Parliament last week and the week before that. But the most interesting thing that this graph tells us is all about the news cycle's focus on personal politics. So search queries, for example, related to vaping, peaked in early September, right around the time that the first case of a vaping-related illness was reported in Canada. But when you look at that dark gray line, it peaks in relevancy almost as quickly as it drops back down to sort of its baseline. And what's interesting about this is that the same day that the first vaping-related illness was reported in Canada is the same day that Time magazine released the photos of Justin Trudeau in brown face, and that's what obviously sparked the whole scandal. So from this graph, we can conclude or hypothesize that personal issues and personal politics consume the media. And at the same time, the aggressive nature of the media cycle ultimately has the potential to drown out health policy. So these three topics are all addressed as priorities in the health minister's mandate letter, which Peter and Ian will touch on later on this webinar. But on top of these three issues, there are countless other news stories that are federal in scope and that will dominate Minister Hadju's attention. So for example, stories related to drug shortages, export issues, recalls, and medication error reporting gain relevance in federal news cycles time and time again. At the same time, with climate change being top of mind among both Canadians and the federal government, there was also a recent news story about the need to cut back on emissions within the healthcare system. And finally, cannabis in particular will likely grab headlines again this week. Edibles are expected to hit shelves legally for the first time either today or tomorrow. So with the introduction of any new policy or law, we can likely expect stories from across the country regarding potentially negative impacts or just trivial news stories about the new legislation now that it has come into effect for Canadians. But in addition to these federal health issues, each province and territory is also mired in their own health news cycles. So on this slide, it's really just a super tiny high-level snapshot of recent health articles out of just a few provinces. So Alberta Health Services, for example, the big news out of Alberta is that they're downsizing with more than 750 frontline nurses potentially losing jobs. In Atlantic Canada, access to family doctors and home care issues have continued to make headlines over the past year. And of course, here in Ontario, Ontario health teams and hallway healthcare are hugely top of mind. So in addition to the countless federal health issues that are cropped up in news cycles, each of these provincial issues will also be on the health minister's radar. And they all have the potential to distract her from her daily duties in her role. And it will require her attention to be pulled away from the priorities laid out in her mandate to focus on all of these local issues that are relevant due to, obviously, the news cycle. So keeping the health minister's mandate in mind, I'm going to turn it back to Peter to walk you through the new minority government.
Thanks, Hannah. So we'll just jump right into it then. I think that's a nice lead-in to kind of take a look at a slide that we've had up here before when we have gathered on the internet previously. When we first put up the slide, we took a look at, so what were the commitments that the government had yet to fulfill based on what they had promised, and what was in the platform. And this is a beautiful timing to be able to gather here. We can now compare to this to what is in the mandate letter. So to briefly summarize, there was a couple of commitments on nutrition policy the government had yet to complete. So that's marketing to kids, front of pack labeling. There was a couple reviews into the Pan-Canadian Health Organization. I believe the second one being led by Leslie Thompson has been more focused on implementation. So what do you do with those organizations that comprise about, I think, about $500 million of annual funding, like CADITH, CIHI, and how will all those work with the new Canada Drug Agency? There's a regulatory review of drugs, which was not a political commitment, but one that started under the last mandate and is set to continue up until 2021, 2022, which involves everything from, I believe, all different types of drugs, and it actually might go broader than that, to some other products. There is self-care products initiative. So this is where they're redoing how they rank the risk of different products that you can get over the shelf and what sort of rigor of review they have to go through to get to market. So that could be, a sunscreen that has a medical product might require more intrusive clinical trials process than, say, a sunscreen with no medical product and Canadians' ability to get that off the shelf. That will actually have a broad impact on a number of products across the board that may impact you. Defining and implementing pharmacare, and then drugs for rare diseases is one that is continually coming up. And I would argue that that's one that is of utmost importance to provinces and territories because it's their single largest growth item on their drug budgets. And the federal government had committed $500 million to flow to that starting in 2022. Pair that with their new campaign commitments and we get a new mandate letter. And I would say that, and I know a lot of people on this webinar right now have been around a long time. Before this Trudeau government, these letters weren't public. And I don't think I've seen a set of mandate letters as detailed as the ones that we're seeing this past week. It's clear this is a government that wants to get a lot done and get a lot done quickly and be very transparent about all the things they would like to prove that they are doing in order to justify this is a government that's going to go to another election saying we earned the trust to get our majority now. That's their objective, is to get back to majority. So there's some significant shout outs that you can all see here. Pharmacare is going to take up a lot of the new minister's attention. And I think the greatest challenge to pharmacare is that you have a minister that will be distracted by not only all the things that Hannah ran through, the day-to-day challenges of the job, but also all these other things on the mandate letter that are no small pieces of significant policy development, especially when you have to start dealing with challenging ethical files such as medical assistance in dying, which I know Minister Lametti is leading, but I'm sure the health minister will be hand in hand as the health minister was last time. I won't go into, I'm more than happy to kind of, if people have specific questions about the mandate letter, but I would argue that from here, the government now needs to go and create processes to develop this policy. And that has yet to be articulated. Some of them are already in process. Some of them need new processes. So I would say on the Canada Drug Agency, that's something where they've had funding for the past year. So you would argue that they would bring a package to the new minister based on work that had been done to date. Drug shortages is in the mandate letter, but the government's known that this has been an issue for 6 months or so. So it will be further along than, say, other things. A national dental care, I would put that in another bucket of that's the government looking to appease the NDP to a certain extent, and that's them supporting a parliamentary study, which won't take much of the minister's time. So there's a different amount of work that will go into each one of these commitments. Some of them are midstream, some of them are new, some of them they can kind of push off to a different process that won't necessarily distract the minister. We could talk forever on this slide, but I'll try and keep moving. And flag the relevance of two important stakeholder groups for this health minister. One, provincial and territorial premiers and her territorial ministerial colleagues, provincial and territorial ministerial colleagues. They will define a lot of what this minister can or can't do. I think the one person we don't have on here is the Minister of Finance, and the last set of health accords that we had, the Minister of Finance and the finance ministers across the country were integral in the success of that. So I think you will see that group and how agreeable that group is to moving forward will be interesting. And I would actually say an interesting webinar would just be on how you negotiate with provinces and territories. I would love to have a conversation about that, because what happened last time was very interesting, where each province and territory, they might have had some other issue that they need addressed, and all of a sudden that becomes relevant when you're negotiating a health accord. So how you get something done will be interesting when the federal government wants something from you as well too. And then of course, Chrystia Freeland. Minister Freeland is the rock star of the federal Liberals. She's the implementer in chief. She's the Prime Minister's right-hand person who will have a key role in anything intergovernmental, and I think pharmacare will be one of those things. So how her office is shaped, who she relies on for advice within the civil service, I would gather it's probably PCO, will be quite fascinating. And I think that you'll see individuals ministers have a ongoing working relationship with Minister Freeland, or I should say Deputy Prime Minister Freeland, as she works her way across the country and has already. So what happens next? So we've had cabinet, Parliament's been back. They passed, their first number of tests. The Bloc Québécois has supported them. We have a new speaker. Speaker Rhoda is in the House. Speech from the throne. They still need to vote on that. And mandate letters now out. So the two things that are going to drive your attention, in addition to one other thing, but I'll wait until the last slide. Once the House of Commons, once the internal committee agrees on the composition of committees, which they'll have to report back to very quickly in January, because it's 10 sitting days that they have to report back, and I think we're at 7 or 8 right now. Then all of a sudden the Finance Committee will kick in on the pre-budget consultation. Then the committee of the Health Standing Committee will be looking at what studies it wants to pursue. So now would be the time to think of, what are the studies that you think are important, and who is on your short list of people to call in order to put the bug in the ear of the right people. Even though the minister's office is separate from the committee process, the rule about Fight Club, don't speak about Fight Club, they're not completely separate. They might be asked for advice at one point, but don't get me wrong, committees have ultimate authority over what they will study. And once that committee membership is listed, you will have a little bit of work to do in order to get on their radar and come up with a mutually beneficial study for members of Parliament and stakeholders alike. That's the sweet spot. And the last thing is Budget 2020. The Finance Minister will kick off, separate from the Finance Committee, their own budget consultation process. You'd expect that to come in the next month or so. That's usually when it comes. I think the budget will be a little later this year. They're doing their fall economic statement today to tee up what the numbers will be leading into the budget and how they will pay for the number of things that are in the Minister of Health mandate letter, let alone other mandate letters. So keep in mind, this is a government that's going to be focused on survival. These minority governments are tenuous. I had the opportunity to work in the Dalton McGuinty minority government. It was the most exhausting experience of my life. You are trying to maintain the support of opposition parties. You're trying to better represent stakeholders, something that it's funny how is forgotten in majority government. Then all of a sudden they wake up and stakeholders are important again. I've been through that. And you have to make sure that you're being responsive to the media cycle. They will not be able to withstand an SNC for 2 months in a minority government like they could in a majority government. Folks will be looking for high value opportunities. And it could be something as simple as a nice public-private members bill that gives some good, tangible messages to the public. You could actually even see a situation where the government is trying to look for opportunities to work with the opposition parties. When I was in Deb Matthews' office in Ontario, at one point we were told, what are the least, how do I choose these words rightly? What are the private members' bills that will provide the most impact and I'm using the wrong words, but the least damage, because they wanted to just turn 5 NDP bills into government bills to give them some policy wins, show that they can work across the aisle. Things like that are potential things that they could be working on. You've already seen parliamentary committees, their use of parliamentary committees when it comes to a national dental care study. There will be other things like that. These are easy ways to work across the aisle in a multi-partisan way in the hopes to come up with something potential and public to the public to show policy is getting done. Ian wrote this next point around how noise can drive policy, and this kind of goes back to the other comment about the media cycle. Making a splash can have a great impact in minority context where the voices of the opposition party will snowball with your own voice when it comes to public policy issues. I think vaping is one really to watch. cannabis vaping as well as tobacco vaping. That's something that's very public and one that'll snowball as public policy experts get behind that. Depending where they fall, it's a tough one, but the government's the regulator and the caught in the middle, and they're going to deal with a lot of noise, and they'll need to figure that one out. The last point about the mandate letter, there's a lot in the mandate letter. There really is a lot. So I think there's a lot in there that you can go back and point to and say, this is how we're connected to your own mandate, their government. But I would also say that because it's not in the mandate letter doesn't mean it's a priority. It just means that your job is to articulate why it should be a priority banked against all the other priorities that the government might have. There's a lot that got done in the first mandate that was not part of the mandate letter, and there's going to be a lot that will get done that is not part of the mandate letter this time. You need to figure out what the win is for the bureaucracy, what the win is for the political staff, what win is there for the central agencies, and define your win in there as well too. So 1 point, loop back to the mandate letter. Why is it important? Second point, if it's not in the mandate letter, how are you going to articulate why it should be important? And I'll end on this slide, and then if there's any questions, please, more than happy, Hannah, Ian, and I to tackle those. Remember that health is only one component of the overall government's agenda. The benefit here is that you have an entire department, a minister, you have many ministers who are invested in health, so don't just think about the health minister or what's the seniors minister doing, what's the minister of labor doing, what's the minister of intergovernmental affairs, the finance minister. But they have a lot of other things on their agenda, and you need to figure out how you can compete with those other agendas for the health minister's time, and helping the health minister compete amongst her other colleagues' priorities as well too. That's the second level down, where you need to support the health minister when you need the health minister's support. There's a lot of files that are going to be really tough. PMPRB, I know, is one that's been going on for several years. There's a lot of people on this call that have some significant investment in that file, either from a patient group standpoint, from a pharmaceutical standpoint, from a public health agenda. There's a lot of stakeholders on varying opinions on this file, and it's one that I think will occupy a lot of time for the PMPRB and for the government in the next couple months as you work towards implementation in the new year. Medical assistance in dying is going to be a significant policy file that is going to move fast and involve a number of complex questions, and the government needs to decide how broad they will go. I'd argue that any legislation that doesn't include advanced directives will not make it very far in a minority government. Pharmacare we've talked about. Drugs for rare diseases we talked about. Cannabis 2.0 is going to come back because there's a mandatory review of the medical regime, and you also have products hitting shelves tomorrow. Some of those products may cause a little bit of public controversy, speaking of which, and vaping, and where the public health community is evolving on this, where the public health community perhaps is where it was several years ago, and where the government is something that will need to be rectified. The landscape is totally different. Sorry, I'm talking so much. I'll finish up in 2 seconds. The landscape is very different now than it was a couple of years ago already. NDP is back to the traditional levels of support. You have an entire new conservative leadership race that is going to galvanize conservative supporters and give a grassroots to the conservatives that perhaps they didn't have this past election, where the Liberals arguably beat them. You have a new Green leader, and you have a strong Bloc Québécois. It's a very different parliament. It's a very different Canada, and it's going to evolve significantly in the next 2 years as the Conservative Party decides what sort of party they are. And they have to do that in the next 2 years because arguably the government could fall apart tomorrow. They could just lose one vote. You'll recall at the very beginning of the last mandate, the Liberals were in a majority, obviously, a comfortable majority, and the Speaker had to break a tie vote on a government piece of legislation. A small slip up was made. You had a bunch of cabinet ministers at a retreat 30 minutes away. The bells rang and they didn't have the bums in seats, and the government came precariously close to losing in a majority government, let alone a minority. You can imagine there's going to be things happening like ministers and MPs are not allowed being away from the Hill within 20 minutes of the Hill. So if you're looking to get meetings, if you're looking to get ministers across Canada, if you're looking to get your MPs across Canada, you're going to be confined to Ottawa. They will be kept to Ottawa when the House is sitting, and it will make it more challenging for organizations outside of Ottawa to engage. So I would imagine there's going to be a lot more activity in Ottawa. And last but not least, it's a constant campaign. You're going to see a lot of activity over the next, oh, we got somebody on video. Very nice to see you. We're going to see a lot of activity over the next 2 years because we're going to be in a very busy standpoint as the government looks to try and earn a majority and as the oppositions try to get to minority. So I'm going to stop. Been talking a lot. Sorry about that. And if there are any questions, feel free to type it in or I'm going to mute everybody, but allow you to unmute yourself. If you would like to ask something verbally, just unmute yourself and feel free to ask. Otherwise, type it in. And no questions is also fine. All right, we'll give you a last call here. If there's no questions, we'll just hop right. Oh, there we go. Ian, do you want to tackle this one? How will it impact provincial initiatives?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's going to have a huge impact. Where the federal government sits right now is a lot of the files and issues that Peter went over, particularly in health, such as pharmacare, drugs for rare diseases. There's a lot of opportunity there for federal provincial negotiation in order to move these things forward. And I think it will put provinces, knowing where the federal government sits currently, it will put provinces in a considerable amount of negotiating power, probably more so than they previously had under the majority government, in order to try to get out of those negotiations the way they want to see those policies move forward. So a good one on pharmacare, you already saw Minister Elliott signal publicly that her government's preference is that the focus be on drugs for rare diseases, and less so on moving forward with provinces on a national pharmacare plan. So you may start to see things change in terms of individual bilateral agreements with provinces based on their own preferences. Obviously, the federal government is still going to have their broad agenda that they want to move forward, and it's not to say they'll water down everything for the provinces, but I think this will put provincial governments in a much stronger negotiating power and opportunity than they previously would have had before. In the previous government, this is less health, but the federal government had a lot of challenges in dealing with the provinces on infrastructure funding, where they felt like the provinces were sort of dragging the puck a bit in terms of finalizing negotiation and moving those things forward. So it will be interesting to see, across the board how these things shake out. As there's still politics at play, both levels. The federal government and the provinces are going to, do a degree of grandstanding when these negotiations move forward. But I think what you are going to start to see is, especially as arguably both Prime Minister Trudeau and Premier Ford are both really trying to do a bit of a reset, is those two stakeholders particularly might be more inclined to work together than they would have been before. Obviously, that can fall apart just as easily as it starts to move ahead, but you have seen a little bit more of a cordial relationship between those two. And of course, the speech from the throne really signaled a desire to work in a more constructive and conciliatory manner with provinces. So it will be interesting to see how that shakes out.
Keep in mind when provincial premiers are up for re-election, as they get closer to re-election, their messaging will change and they'll have to decide, is it good or bad for them to be in a fight with the federal government, and actions will go on from there. Jeff, I'll answer your question, but first, Manny, thank you. I should have also said we welcome compliments. So if anybody else would like to jump on Manny's bandwagon, we're happy for that too. Jeff, great question. So where it's at, by way of background for folks that don't know, the Pan-Canadian Health Organization review started right when Minister Petitpas-Taylor was made Minister of Health. And that was PG Foray and Dr. Danielle Martin proposed this report to fundamentally change the focus of Pan-Canadian health organizations who are funded by the federal government to support provincial and territorial health policy development. So that report came out. It was a strong report that was, you could argue it was tough politically to do or good politically to do. Either way it could go, because there are some agencies that they actually recommended wrapping up, and that's always tough to do. So the government wasn't quite sure how to proceed, which is why they created a review of the review led by Leslie Thompson of Accreditation Canada. That was supposed to report back to the minister last spring, and it didn't. So now we're in a situation where, is the government going to do what they need to do with these organizations in order to carve out the role of the Canada Drug Agency? Will some of the roles and responsibilities of existing agencies go into this new agency, or will this do something different? And what do they do with some of the other organizations like substance use, like cancer? There are a couple that will probably either need to prove their worth to government, or there might be an opportunity to amalgamate in different cases. But to cut this short, Jeff, the answer is nobody really knows. I think we'll see in the next couple months if the government wishes to continue with that work, and I would argue they have to continue in some form or another. It just depends how much and how far. And I'll do a last call for questions. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for getting on the compliments train. We appreciate it. Okay, we'll wrap it up if there's no other questions. Thanks, everybody. We hope you have a great Christmas, great holiday time off. And if there's something you would like us to touch on in the new year, we're happy to gather again and do this as long as people find it important. And Hannah just sent me a note. There's the survey. I'll put that back in the chat, but we can also circulate that around if you so wish. I'll just type that in right now again, and then we'll let you go. Thanks, everybody.